Hey, how's it going? I am going to review with you how I started the pen portion on my pen and ink drawing, and I'm also going to show you the next part of it, which is starting to build up some darker values. So just to kind of show you what we're going for here today, this still is very much outlined in pencil. It still has its grid on it, but I am starting to build some of those values on the face, getting some of those darker areas, but not going too dark yet. So what I've got here is I've basically gone around on my reference photo and outlined, and I like to outline in a colored pen because I find it just helps it stand out a little bit easier. I've gone around and outlined the lightest values on my reference photo. So wherever you see those lighter highlights. Now, if you're not quite sure if something counts as a light highlight, just throw it in there anyway. You can always add more pen. You can always make something darker, but you can't make it lighter. So it's best to just start out carefully. So I've already started this process on this drawing, but I'm just going to review with you how we started the process. So like I said, I've gone through and I've outlined on my reference photo all of my highlights. And then what I did was I drew those shapes that I saw in pencil. It's very, very important that this is done in pencil and that it's drawn very lightly. I've gone around in pencil and basically recreated those shapes that I created on my reference photo onto my drawing. So in pencil, very, very lightly, because it's got to be erased at some point, gone around and marked off all of those highlights. Now I'm going to show you a new one that I haven't done quite just yet, and that's going to be this one on the hand over here. So I'm just going to go around very, very lightly, mark off where I see those lighter areas. This is what I did on the face. It's the exact same thing. Just recreating those shapes. Okay, you know what? I think there's kind of one right here too on that knuckle, so I'm going to include that. Really look for those highlights, ladies. There's one right there. And then there's some up here on the top of the hood. So I'm going to get that. Very lightly trace a shape around that. And I've got a big one right here. And then there's one over here too. So what you want to do now is you've got all these different sizes of pens. I know it can be tricky sometimes to, have all these different pen sizes and be like, oh, I don't want to accidentally use the wrong size. Take your smallest pen and then put all the other ones to the side for right now. Again, this is just a review of what we did to lay out those lighter midtones. So these things that you drew shapes around, those are your highlights, the lightest areas. They're not going to get any pen at all. Everything outside of those shapes has some value to it. They're a little bit darker than your highlights, so those get little dots. Now you want to start with really, really spaced out, or sparse is a more technical term, really spaced out dots. Now what I like to do is I like to draw dots around my highlights, again, really, really spread out, kind of following along that pencil that I created, that pencil outline. So that way, when you do end up erasing those pencils, you can kind of see here the outline of where that highlight is, but it's not too obstructing. It's not too, kind of zoom in here a little bit. It's not too much. So then you can kind of fill that space with dots, and that highlight will blend in nicely with the rest of the face. So that's all I'm doing down here. I'm going to spread out very, very loosely. I had them a little bit too close together here, so it's got a little too much of an outline effect to it. So I'm being very careful to spread these dots out as I'm going around the edge of that highlight. I don't want them to be too close together because this area is where you are very, very light. So those dots are going to be very sparse. So I'm just going to go around and I'm going to start laying down a nice loose dot pattern. Very spread apart. Not erasing any pencil lines just yet. We still need them for a lot of things. So I'm not really outlining anything here. I'm just laying down a pattern. I'm going to go a little bit faster just for the sake of this demonstration, but you really want to take your time doing this, being careful. If you go too fast, sometimes your dots will look sort of like shooting stars. So let's say I do a dot really fast, and sometimes they can just have a little bit of a tail to them. You do not want that. You don't want them to have a tail. You just want them to be nice, clean, round dots. And you want them to be pretty random too. You don't really want to go in like a straight line like this. You want to kind of randomize where you are putting those dots. Because sometimes if you have a straight line of dots or a perfect circle of dots, it just stands out a little bit too much. It feels a little bit artificial, and you want this value to look natural. Okay, so that gets us started. I'm going to throw a few dots over here, throw a few dots over here. And going a little faster just for the sake of the demo, don't go too fast. Okay. Okay. Now what we want to do now, we're not going to erase that highlight edge just yet. Now we can start going in here and start to build up some of these values. So one that I pointed out during class last time was this shadow that's on the face. Now, if you want, you can draw shapes around your shadows. Just make sure that you don't get them confused with your highlight shapes. You know, maybe it might be a good idea to trace your shadowy areas with a different color, so that way that you know that that is not a highlight, it's a shadow. Okay? But you don't necessarily have to draw shapes around your shadows. What you can do, let me try to find an area here where I can demonstrate this. So for example, up in here, I don't really have a shape around my shadow, but I do have this really, really great shadow that kind of gets a little bit darker around on the eyelid. So what I'm going to do is, I'm going to say that I don't want to go too dark right here. I think that's a good area to keep a little bit lighter, is that spot right there. So I'm going to start very, very carefully and slowly, not going crazy just yet, start to build up some dots that are a little bit more dense, a little bit more closer together on that eyelid. And that's going to start to create a little bit of a shadowy effect. I want to stay out of that circle I just drew, that little oval bean shape, because I want that to be less dense. That's the top of the eyelid. It's not quite as light as a highlight, but it's a little bit lighter than, you know, say the rest of the eyelid. So I'm going to try to avoid that area. You know, use your pencil to help you, and use it in ways that make sense to you. You know, draw shapes around your shadows, around your highlights. So I'm just going to kind of start to fill in this area with a little bit more density. And I'm really looking in my photo, how far out does that shadow go? It goes out pretty far. So again, this might be a good place for you to draw a shape around that shadow and then draw it on your reference photo, just so that you know that that's where things are going to get really, really dark. But we're not going too dark just yet. Just starting to build up some density. Now when you are ready to go darker, I'm still using my smaller pen. I'm not using a bigger pen just yet. We can always do that later. You know, start to really build up some density. If you need to go darker, you can always go back in later with a bigger pen and make it even more dense, but we want to do this gradually, especially if this is something that you're not super confident in, and that's okay. This might be something that you haven't really had a lot of experience with yet. That's why we are learning today. So I'm really starting to densen up some of those areas that are darker. And really make sure that you are looking at your reference photo almost constantly. Constantly look back and forth. You don't want to just get carried away with putting a pattern of dots anywhere in random places, because then it's not really going to be true to your reference that you're looking at. Be constantly looking at your reference photo. Right now I'm looking at that little bit of a shadow around the side of the eye and doing my best to just build up some density. And that kind of blends away into the shadows over here, this really dark shadow along there. I'm going to get that in a moment. Right now I'm just worrying about building a little bit more value, not going too crazy. I know it can be tempting to fill in those really, really dark areas right off the bat. And you can. I'm not saying that you can't do that. You know, if you really, really felt tempted to, you could take a thicker pen. I'm going to use a 3. I'm not going to go too big just yet. You know that this spot right here is very, very dark. So I'm going to say, what the heck? I can go in here and outline that edge because I know that it's very, very dark over here. I'm going to zoom out just a little tiny bit. I know that this over here is very dark. Now be very careful when you're outlining things. You don't want to have any hairy lines or anything like that. So let's say that I did that. And then I can kind of come in here and start to very, very lightly fill in that shadow. But then the shadow does not have a very hard edge. You know, even the most crisp of shadows have a little bit of a gradual change from dark to light. It doesn't just jump from dark to light. It has a little bit of a value shift. So let's say that you filled in this area with black. You know, come back in here with your pen and maybe start to blend that edge out just a little teeny, teeny, tiny bit so that it flows into your other values a little bit smoother. Yeah, I'm doing this kind of messy. You want to make sure that you are thinking about your craftsmanship, taking your time, being careful. You know, pace yourself. Don't go too slow to where you're behind. But don't rush to the point where you're being sloppy with your work. So my shadow's got a little bit of a fade on the edge now. Now it's not so crisp. So see how much better that looks from this area to this. Look at how big that jump between the value is there, but here it blends beautifully, a beautiful blend. That's what you want. So I'm coming in here. I'm going to go back to my smaller pen, and I'm just building up some more values. Now, to kind of show you what the other one looks like that I was working on. You know, you can see in here I'm building up the values around the nose. And maybe... And maybe you want to start filling in some of those darker areas on the face. Don't go crazy just yet. You know, fill in areas that... Sorry. A lot of people. Okay, so, you know, if you see a really, really dark area and you feel like it's going to be okay to just sort of fill it in, you know, then by all means, go ahead and fill that area in. I'm seeing a really, really dark edge over here on the lip. So I'm going to fill that part in, but remember, you want there to be a nice, smooth transition between those values. And again, ladies, as always, you know, if you want to draw shapes around things to guide you in filling them in, like I have a very, very dense area in here, I'm going to go ahead and go into my number 3 pen. I'm keeping the 5 and the 8 out of the way for right now. I'm going to just use the 01 and the 03. I don't want to accidentally use something that's too thick right away. But, you know, start to build up some of your values, some of your darker values. And if you feel okay with, you know, finding an area that's really, really dark, like let's say let me take a look back at this. Like let's say I have her eye, the line of her eye here where her eye opens, that little bit right there. You know, if you feel like you are ready to sort of just go in there and darken that up, go ahead and do it. But do it very, very lightly and cautiously. Try to keep your, you know, blocking in big areas to a minimum. See how much you can just stipple. And, you know, if you got to use your thicker pen to stipple, you can. You know, if you've got a big area to cover, like let's say I have, let me go back to this one. I keep flipping back and forth here, but she's got this really dark area on the side of her lip right here. You know, maybe it's time to go into the 05, because that's a really, really big, dense area. You know that that's very, very dark. But instead of just filling it in, you know, like scratching it in with my pen, I am just going to do a very dense pattern of stippling. So do what makes sense, ladies. You know, I'm here to help you and guide you along, but, you know, you're the artist. You're the one that's looking at your reference photo. Make those big artistic decisions that only you can make as the artist. Now, of course, you got to think about your craftsmanship, your value. Do you have a nice full range of value? Do the values help create a sense of roundness? Those things are important. But only you can really figure out where these things go, because it is your work. So, just to kind of review what we did here. From the beginning, laying in a very, very loose pattern of dots. Section off your highlights. Section those things off with pencil. And then fill in the areas around it with a loose pattern of dots, or whatever shading technique you are using. Once you've done that, you can start to go in here and look for some value changes, the roundness of the fingers. If it helps you to draw shapes around those shadows, definitely use that to your advantage. That is a technique that you are welcome to use. So I know that in here, things are going to get pretty dark, but not too dark. You know, you only want these to be just a little bit denser than the rest of your dot pattern that you've got going on around here. Once you've done that, you can go in there and start to find even darker values. Like her finger kind of disappears over here. You can start to make those dots even more dense so that you define those round areas. And of course you want to let your ink dry before you erase anything. But you know, kind of erase, if you do draw lines around your shadows, kind of erase them as you go along. I like to leave the highlight areas outlined in pencil until the very, very end, just so that I don't accidentally fill it in with dots when I didn't mean to. But everywhere else, go ahead on in there and start to build up your values. Slowly, carefully, think about your craftsmanship. Start with your smaller pens and work your way up to your big ones. So that's basically the whole process, ladies. When you really feel like you are ready to go darker, you can go in with your bigger pens and start to really, really fill in those dense areas with the same amount of love and care that you are giving everything else. But save your bigger pens for last. Make sure you always have a nice smooth transition from one value to the next. Unless it really looks like there's a big shift in value, you want to create that nice blend. And look for shadows that you may not have noticed right off the bat. So that's pretty much it for today, ladies. And as always, if you need any help at all, please do not hesitate to reach out to me. I'm more than happy to help you. See you later.